one man came along and he did something that popularized the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like a focus on the path, not just nominal worship. Some of you may be thinking, weren't people believers? Yes, they were believers, but nominal believers. The focus wasn't on the hereafter as much as it should be. I don't know what we would say today. I don't think it's the case today either. So one man came along, 450 Hijri, and he had some personal experiences. He died in 505 at the age of 55 only. But with him, he is considered to be the man that popularized Sufism among the masses, made it acceptable for them, because the way he explained these things. You have to remember, many of the Sufis spoke in illusions. They spoke in illusions in very high kind of language. So for the common folk, it was very difficult for them to understand that. And until now, there was no formal Shaykh-Murid relationship. There were no tariqs until now. 5th century, until Imam Ghazali died, there were hardly any formal tariqs. In fact, none. They began afterwards. So we're still talking about early times, 5th century, 6th century, coming 6th century. Imam Ghazali, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, Hujjatul Islam, who died in 505, which is 1111 Gregorian, he is the one who is considered responsible for turning people's attention to the yearning of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because of the way he described through his magnum opus, which is the Ihya Ulumuddin in numerous volumes, the way he explained this, which is called the revival of the religious sciences. He was obviously not one who was born into Sufism. His father died at a young age, and he was looked after by somebody else, and his mother. And he and his brother was a very famous Sufi, Hamid al-Ghazali, right? Who fares very prominently in the Sufi circles as well. But Shaykh Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, he was into the sciences first. And it's famous about him that he was into the science first, and he became such a great scholar because he was ingenious. He was remarkable in his understanding and in his memory and in everything, that he was put into the highest place that any scholar could be put. And they had one vizier whose name was he was known as Nizam al-Mulk. He was Shafi'i, and he established a series of colleges, universities. One in Naysabur or Nishapur, another one in Baghdad, and Shiraz and other areas. The Baghdad one, like we have Harvard today, Yale, we have Oxford, Cambridge. The Baghdad one was the center of learning. Baghdad was the center of the caliphate. This is where many of the scholars flocked. You had some good scholars there. Imam Ghazali was originally from Persia. He was from Tus, which is in Iran today. But he went to Baghdad as well. And people recognized, and remember, he's very young. He died at the age of 55. And he left everything for at least 11, 12 years, and then some more years after that. So this was probably when he was 30-something, he became the top scholar of the country, of the Islamic lands. Coveted position, everybody wanted that position. He got it. And he started, and his crisis was different, because the thing about Imam Ghazali was, many people, if we study something, we will study it with a bias. And I'm not trying to do that here. I'm trying my best, right? But it's very difficult for people to completely shed everything that you know about something and to study it. Most people can't do it. What he did was, he said, I came to a crisis in my faith. I didn't know what to believe. About Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says there were 3 main groups that were prominent in my time. The Sufis, the Batinites, and the philosophers. Muslim philosophers. That taken from the Greek philosophy. The Neoplatonists. He said, I studied each one of these groups. The Batinites, they talked about some inner reading, hidden reading of the Quran. So they wouldn't take it says, Aqimus Salah, establish the prayer, they wouldn't take that. They would say, it means something else in between. So they could write, and it was a highly secretive, kind of arcane cult. These were the Batinites. Right? Alhamdulillah, we no longer have a formal group called the Batinites, but that was their function. So it's only the Imam who knows the true understanding, and you have to be entered into this group to be able to learn that. He says that can't be the right way. So he began to study these things, and I'm not encouraging this for all of us, because I don't think most of us could handle that kind of thing, right? But he said, I stripped my mind of all beliefs. I was in a crisis, and I went and studied this. I found that this couldn't be it. Then I studied the Sufis. And I studied the philosophy. He says, in 2 years, despite my busy schedule, in my free time, I studied all of the books of the philosophers. And then he wrote a book called the Exposition, the Maqasid al-Falasifa, right? The main objectives of the philosophers. It was such a great book that was written in such a neutral way, that one, that the later, even Christian philosophers consider him to be among the Muslim philosophers, because they think his contribution is great. Then after that, when he found out that it's a lot of incoherence in there, they say one thing, but it can't be really true because there's somebody else that contradicts it. There's no absolute truth in there. Then he wrote the Tahafutul Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. And in there he did what no other scholar until now had done. Because the philosophy was coming into the Muslim circles, and there were people who had taken it on, like Ibn Sina, Al-Farabi, and one of the Razis, and none of the Muslim scholars were able to oppose it properly, because they hadn't studied it. He studied it, and then the way he wrote about it, he says, I can't understand. Look at the demeaning way he writes about it. He says, I can't understand how these people even can come to this conclusion. Even a young child would not come to this conclusion. So not only did he defend the Ahlul Sunnah, the orthodoxy against this, he'd ridiculed them. He ridiculed them. And so then he discovered that that's not the way. He said, if there is any way, it's the way of the Sufis. He said, I wanted to leave my position because then I started recognizing that I'm doing all of this for show. I'm in the highest position. I'm the most celebrated scholar, and he started saying that this was all for vain glory and arrogance and self-conceit, and there's no ikhlas. And he said, I had this internal dilemma. Now I had my faith. I knew what I was longing for, but I had to get out of this position. But I couldn't. You've got a position, it's difficult to leave a position. He says, Allah made it easy for me. He inflicted me with a calamity that I was unable to speak. If you are one to give durus, if you're one to teach to all of the great scholars of the time, and you can't speak anymore, that's a calamity for you. But he said that helped me finally make up my mind, because I used to make up my mind, but then I used to break it. Finally, this time when this happened, I realized that I had to leave this. He left it. People were like, why are you leaving this? People couldn't understand what I was doing. It was crazy for anybody to do, because it was considered the highest position. He went, he left. He stayed for about 10 to 11 years. Nobody knows exactly what he did during those times. We know he went to Jerusalem, stayed there for a long time. He went to the Haramain, he stayed there for a while, and a lot of the time he spent in Damascus in the Jami al-Umawi, in a room there. This is when he wrote the revival. He says, this is where Allah opened up many things to me. This is when I got my realization, when I got my enlightenment. That's when he wrote the Ihya Ulumuddin, the revival of the religious sciences. He comes back finally, and he doesn't want to take that position there. He's being forced to take this position. Finally, he agreed to do some teaching close to his hometown and took on some students. And then he wrote a number of other books. The Beginning of Guidance, he wrote the Mishkatul Anwar, he wrote. But his book, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, Ihya Ulumuddin, is the one that popularized tasawwuf. The way he explains, he's a Persian, highly articulate. He's considered one of his literature is studied in the history of Arabic literature. And you should read it. He's a psychologist. The way he speaks, the way he explains things, absolutely fantastic. Yes, there are criticisms on him. Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Jawzi, a number of these scholars have criticized aspects of his work. Basically, their criticism is that he's mentioning things in there which are difficult for other people to understand, and according to them, it's extreme things, right? The science is such, the science is. He mentions a lot of weak hadith, no doubt he does, right? Some fabricated narrations in the book as well, no doubt that those are there. He wasn't a hadith scholar. He actually studied studying hadith afterwards on his way back. He died with a copy of Sahih al-Bukhari or something on his chest. He went into hadith study afterwards. Right? So that's difficult for us to understand today, because most of the focus of, for example, a subcontinent madrasas is on hadith. Not as much on tafsir, for example, or on aqidah even for that matter. Hadith is very strong. But when it comes to aqidah, serious theology and serious tafsir, it's not as strong as the hadith. But that's just the way it is. We're human beings and we can't become, it's very difficult to master everything on a mass level. Right? So his focus had been something different. But now he started mastering hadith. And he popularized. Basically what scholars say is that he guaranteed Sufism an official place in Orthodox Islam alongside law and theology. Just like Aqidah was a subject and fiqh became a subject, hadith studies was another science, tasawwuf became a subject. That's why if you look at many of the books, they will have a section on tasawwuf. Unfortunately now you don't see many of these books. Things have been stripped off them. And I'll explain why that came about. You'll understand from the rest of our discussion when all of this came about.